Lightning was startled, and she decided to fly back first to consult with Maisie. After briefly explaining the situation, Maisie suggested that they could extinguish the torches and sneak in, so the demons wouldn't be able to see them. Maisie could transform into an owl, allowing them to have night vision. Lightning felt useless, having run away at the first sign of fear. Maisie rubbed against Lightning's face, comforting her, suggesting no one could continue to shout for months under a demon's siege. Plus, as an adventurer, shouldn't Lightning be interested in these peculiar adventures? After hesitating for a moment, Lightning decided to follow Maisie's advice. Lightning wanted to overcome her fear, but why was Maisie so interested in exploring the ruins? She asked Maisie, "Is it because of the rewards of a basket full of eggs?" The owl blinked its round eyes and turned its head away. The atmosphere relaxed considerably, and Lightning gradually calmed down. Once again standing at the entrance of the ruins, Lightning took a deep breath, tightly grasping her revolver, and cautiously walked into the profound darkness. Lightning slowed her pace, carefully testing the edge of the stairs, then cautiously made her way down. After a turn, she suddenly saw a magic stone on the wall brightening the room. She carefully walked to the junction of the staircase where she saw water dripping down. At this point, the cries for help became clearer, as if they were ringing in her ears. In the center of the room was a stone platform with several figures standing on it. From their appearance and robust bodies, they were undoubtedly demons. In the middle of the high platform encircled by demons, stood a massive ice cube, within which was a woman dressed in a magnificent robe. Lightning felt somewhat scared seeing the demons, but Maisie said those demons should already be dead. Before she could finish speaking, Maisie had already flew towards the cube, heading towards the high platform. This startled Lightning so much that she froze on the spot, forgetting to reach out to hold Maisie back. By the time she reacted, Maisie had already pounced on a demon. The demon that was pecked a few times by the owl collapsed with a bang and immediately turned into a pile of ash. Lightning closely observed these stone-like creatures, their bodies covered with tiny cracks. Maisie flew to the top of the ice cube and pecked fiercely. This time it didn't shatter, but instead emitted a crisp knocking sound, indicating its extreme hardness. Lightning placed her hand on the cube, a cold chill seeping through her skin. The woman inside the cube seemed so lifelike, with her long blue hair. Not far from her was a red magic stone, repeatedly echoing the plea, "Save me," over and over again. Lightning and Maisie quickly flew to the outskirts of the town to report the situation to Roland. After listening to Lightning's description, Roland couldn't help but gasp in surprise. He looked at Lightning and thought to himself, Lightning was too audacious, daring to investigate the ancient ruins known to be inhabited by demons, with only a pigeon on her side. What was even more frightening was that there was a witch sealed in the ruins. Lightning also brought back the magic stone. As they opened the box, an anxious female voice suddenly appeared in everyone's ears. The sound was sometimes near, sometimes far, and was quite unnerving. Nightingale revealed herself, detecting magic within the stone. Roland thought for a moment, knew this appears to be a magical recording device that can continuously emit sound. Roland patted Lightning on the head, gently advising her, "Don't do this again, especially venturing into dangerous places without permission." He then looked at Nightingale, telling her to gather all members of the Witches' Union and axe to the office. The plan to search the ruins might need to be expedited. Once everyone had arrived, Roland narrated from beginning to end of the discoveries Lightning had made. Anna understood Roland's implications, the witch might still be alive, and through her, they could learn about events from over 400 years ago. Scroll, however, mentioned that the witch might not belong to that era. Leaf stated that the witch might not necessarily be on their side, a statement that made Roland ponder. Indeed, they both had valid points. If the ruins were left behind by the church, the witch sealed inside might well be on the side with the church. Lightning mentioned the witch's extravagant clothing, Roland suggesting she might be a high-ranking individual. If the woman harbored any bad intentions, there was no guarantee that her abilities would not pose a threat to the Witch Union. Lily suddenly spoke up, surprised that everyone was considering whether the witch was on their side. Rem tried to stop her, but Lily did not cease and questioned how someone from 400 years ago could still be alive. Lightning argued that the woman was completely different from the lifeless demons. Her skin was smooth, and her lips full of color. Maisie kept nodding in agreement. Wendy stepped in to interrupt their argument, saying that regardless of whether the witch was dead or alive, they had to give it a try. Wendy suggested that if she turned out to be a church witch, all they needed to do was attach the god's stone of punishment before she woke up. Moreover, they had Nightingale and Anna. Most importantly, this witch might have information about the calamity 400 years ago. Roland agreed with Wendy. Intelligence about the demons was crucial to Border Town. He had to take the initiative in the future confrontations. Roland looked towards Axe, asking about the status of the First Army. Axe saluted and stated they could only mobilize a maximum of 50 men. The other squads were already recruiting refugees from various places, and they needed to leave forces behind to prevent Timothy from launching a large-scale attack on the Western Territory. Roland nodded in acknowledgement and began to strategize. Suddenly, Rem looked out and gasped. Everyone followed her gaze out the window and was taken aback. Unbelievably, Roland looked outside of the window and saw that the gloomy sky was unexpectedly filled with snow. It was snowing, which was unusual. To his knowledge, the Western Territory only experienced snowfall once during winter, and it wasn't even winter yet. Outside the city walls, demonic beasts were slowly advancing towards the city wall. Roland turned towards Axe, inquiring if there was ever snowfall during the last month of fall. Axe turned into a serious expression, stating that he hadn't experienced such an event in his 8 years in the town. Opening the window, Roland pondered. The heavy snowfall implied the coming of the month of demons, and during this time, the entire Western Territory would face the threat of demonic beasts. Deploying the First Army was out of the question. Even transporting the witches by hot air balloon had become dangerous. He had no choice but to suspend the rescue plan, waiting until the sky clears up. On slumbering island the fjords, Thunder was drinking hot, steaming fish soup. He was eager to start his next adventure. The sights he'd seen on his last expedition had left him stunned. He was very curious about what exactly was on that piece of land. Tilly smiled and mentioned that she planned to personally go to Border Town, also intending to experience the month of demons in the western region, and she invited Thunder to join her. Thunder was silent for a moment, but ultimately refused. He explained that her daughter is having a good time there. After all, anything could happen on an adventure, and he had lost her mother already. He didn't want to lose her as well. Tilly understood what he meant, and she handed him a piece of paper, beginning to talk about business. Although Thunder had helped them a lot, the price for hiring witches had to be according to the rates on the paper. Thunder finished the fish soup in one gulp and laughed out loud. He chose 3 witches and generously offered 4,800 gold. After he left, Ashes hesitated, voicing her concern that although this could bring a substantial amount of wealth to Slumbering Isle, the risk of the abilities of the witches could also be exposed in the process. She was afraid that this information could reach the church. Slumbering Spell is a brand new guild formed by Tilly. Here, explorers from the Fjord Islands can hire witches with suitable abilities to assist them in their adventures or to provide various services like building houses, manufacturing, and repairing items. Making money isn't Tilly's main concern. Instead, she hopes to use the guild to introduce more people to Slumbering Isle and establish relations with them. Thunder once said, "Fear comes from the unknown," so she hopes to start in the fjords, making people accept witches, and understand that witches are not different from them, and are certainly not emissaries of demons. As their conversation went on, they shifted the topic to discuss that Maisie had not yet returned to Slumbering Isle, and they were worried about what might have happened. Ashes mentioned that the living conditions in Border Town were good, and she was worried that the witches might not want to come back. Tilly suddenly suggested, "In that case, let's go there." Ashes was stunned for a moment before she could respond. Tilly laughed, stating that they had promised to help Roland fight against the demonic beasts and bring back the other witches on the way. They needed to start selecting the witches to go to Border Town in the morning. Most importantly, she wanted to see what her annoying brother had turned into. Meanwhile, Roland climbed onto the city wall where soldiers equipped with revolving rifles each watched over their posts. The new city wall was much taller than the previous stone wall, preventing demonic beasts from leaping over. As Roland made his way along the wall, the soldiers straightened their backs and saluted him. Their high spirits already marked a stark contrast to the original state of the militia just a year ago. Just then, the sound of a fierce argument came from behind. Roland looked toward the noise source and saw a group of people arguing loudly in the middle of the residential area. One of them, dressed in a black and white uniform, appeared to be a municipal official. Carter charged directly into the crowd, subduing the instigators of the fight. The prince's personal guards ordered everyone to stop, and the situation was quickly brought under control. Seeing Roland, the man who had been beaten fell to his knees. Roland turned to the official, whose face had been bruised, and asked him what had happened. The official claimed that the refugees had initiated the fight. He had been distributing food when he was suddenly attacked by the damn mad dog refugee. The man restrained by Carter immediately shouted in defense that the official was lying. He claimed that these people had colluded with serfs to extort them, charging money for each serving of food. When Roland had taken them in, he clearly stated that the food was to be distributed for free. Roland was slightly taken aback. The Eastern region refugees had been thoroughly vetted by the city hall, and all craftsmen, literate individuals, or those with special skills had been moved into the inner ring of the town. In theory, those remaining were ordinary civilians. However, the tone and vocabulary of the man didn't match those of a commoner. On the contrary, the city hall member who was full of derogatory words such as damn and mad dog and constant cussing was extremely disappointing. Roland knew most likely this official was a knight from Duke Ryan, who later surrendered. Roland affirmed that he did say that housing and food would be provided for free before they officially joined Border Town, and this promise still stood. He reiterated this in front of all the refugees. Upon hearing this, the refugees loudly praised Roland's kindness and shouted, "Long live the prince!" But, as a brawl had occurred, Roland ordered the personal guards to bring all the people involved to the castle. He wanted to personally adjudicate this incident. The official's face suddenly turned pale. Roland then looked at him asking about the charged porridge and what was really going on. Back in the castle hall, Roland took his seat at the head and looked down at the two men. After everyone had a chance to tell their side of the story, he finally knew what had happened. The official, a man named Koya, resented being stripped of his knighthood and was annoyed by the tedious paperwork of the city hall. His frustration had vented towards the refugees. He took the opportunity of distributing porridge to deliberately charge the refugees and stir up trouble between the two groups. In fact, Koya had been charging for porridge for several days already. Because of his conspicuous city hall uniform, most refugees stayed silent out of fear of reprisal from an official, which only emboldened him. It wasn't until today that someone stood up to protest. Upon understanding the situation, Roland let out a sigh. He hadn't expected corruption and stagnation to have started this early. Roland called Barav to his side and asked in a low voice how such a situation would typically be handled by a lord. Barav responded that if the offender was a noble, he could escape any punishment by handing over a few gold royals. The crime of a commoner attacking a noble could range from amputation to flogging. However, Koya was no longer a noble. Roland pondered for a moment and decided to follow the rules of Grey Castle. He stood up and swept his gaze over the entire hall to deliver his judgment. Koya, for neglected duty and extortion of refugees, was stripped of all his duties in the city hall from this day forth, sentenced to 10 years of labor in the mines, and fined 3 times the amount of his extortionate income. As for Wade, who initiating an attack on a city hall official, was sentenced to 10 strokes of the whip. He reiterated that the distribution of porridge would continue to be free, and all extorted money would be returned. Roland sat in his chair, the incident making him realize that as the number of citizens continued to increase and the authority of the city hall rapidly expanded, it might be time to address the issue of internal regulation. Many modern institutions were not applicable to this era. Legal interpretation and judicial powers were something he needed to keep in his own hands. He needed a simple system that could supervise the organization without requiring too many people. Nightingale appeared, and Roland clasped her hand on his shoulder. He said he wanted to establish a new department to oversee the city hall and arrest any individuals or groups that could potentially threaten the stability of the Western region. This department would be responsible only to him. Roland tentatively named it the Western Territory Security, and he wanted Nightingale to be the chief. Nightingale had the ability to distinguish between truth and lies. Roland said that if Nightingale was willing, he could provide her with a special afternoon tea with ice cream in winter. Nightingale gently pinched his hand and said that she would agree to anything Roland said and anything Roland wanted to do.
Yeah, boy.
Such a system would be in line with the checks and balances of power that are common in many modern political systems, while also addressing the specific needs and constraints of Roland's situation. This kind of internal department could help prevent corruption and could also play a role in maintaining social stability and justice. Wade staggered back to his residence, and the old man immediately greeted him. Seeing the wounds on Wade's back, the old man urgently asked him to lie down. The old man originally wanted to sprinkle ash on the wound, but Wade quickly stopped him, saying that the knight had said that it was fine to leave it open like this, and it would heal in 2 or 3 days. The old man shook his head and said that Wade would have a high fever tonight if left untreated. Wade said his wound wasn't very painful, but rather felt cool and itchy. He knew this was a sign of healing. After the whipping, his back was doused with a bucket of water. The knight told him that this water could eliminate all disease-causing microbes. The old man had never heard of these words. Wade said it must be related to the witches. The old man lowered his head, and after a long time, he said in a deep voice that Wade shouldn't have stood up for him. Wade said that if they continued to tolerate it, they would be treated even worse. He feared that the two of them wouldn't last until the end of winter. Moreover, he purposely chose that time to fight Koya. Wade knew that Prince Roland would appear on the city wall at that time every day. He believed that the prince hated those who tarnished his reputation. He had also found out before that the prince was very kind and wise. Thus he took the bet, and he was correct. The old man was somewhat sad. He knew that Wade could have lived a decent life in Border Town, but he chose to stay here for him. Wade smiled and said that it was the old man who saved him back when he almost died. He patted the old man's shoulder and said everything would get better. On the sea, the weather was getting colder. Captain Jack and the witches were sitting together, sipping fish soup to keep warm. The blonde woman named Andrea praised the taste of the fish soup, but Ashes couldn't stand the fishy smell of the sea fish. Andrea sarcastically said that Ash's taste had been spoiled by the cooking methods of Border Town, and her courage was dwindling. Ashes glared at her, and Andrea laughed and said, "If Ash can't stand the smell of fish, how can everyone expect Ash to stand up when Lady Tilly needs her?" Ashes understood that Andrea was deliberately picking a fight. Ashes disdainfully said that Andrea's arrows could not compare to the weapons of Border Town, and once she tasted Prince Roland's delicacies, she would know. The two were the top witches in Slumbering Isle in terms of combat power and often argued about who was the strongest. Though they often bickered, they would undoubtedly fight side by side without hesitation when danger arose. Suddenly, a sailor burst into the cabin, his face pale with fear, yelling that mutant sea ghosts had appeared. Everyone rushed out of the stern building to see more than a dozen fish-bodied, crab-legged creatures on the deck. They moved swiftly, their 6 legs moving like a giant cockroach. Andrea snapped her fingers, and a golden light emerged from between her fingers, morphing into the shape of a bowl. She was ready to compete with Ashes to see who could kill more. Tilly infused magic into the flying magic stone and soared into the midair, overlooking the entire deck. These monsters were somewhat different from before. As soon as Ashes joined the battlefield, the situation quickly changed. Any demonic beasts daring to face the giant sword would be cut in half. Andrea was not to be outdone. Her magical longbow could shoot anything handy as an arrow, with both power and accuracy being astonishing. Seeing the demonic beasts being quickly killed, Tilly remained alert. She felt a huge monster under the ship, continuously hitting the bottom of the ship. Before she could finish her sentence, a shadow swept from under the ship, and the sailboat began to shake violently again. Tilly landed back on the deck and briefly explained the situation. They had to force it out of the sea. The monster came again. Savvy ran to position and jumped out of the ship's rope. Several circles of hemp rope were tied tightly around her waist. The other end of the rope was in Ash's hands, steadily controlling her descent. The shadow struck, and Savvy instantly opened the barrier. The monster hit the barrier head-on, its huge body suddenly stopped. Savvy let out a muffled hum. Ashes pulled hard with one hand and barely pulled Savvy onto the deck when a giant sea beast had already roared out of the water. In the blink of an eye, Andrea had flown above the monster's head. She summoned the magic ball, pulled the full string, and the arrow made purely of magic power emitted a piercing roar, like a thunderbolt, and penetrated the monster's body. Then there was a loud bang, and it exploded into pieces. Andrea fell into the sea with a plop. Suddenly she began to shout and yell, saying she couldn't swim. Ashes sighed helplessly, shook her head and then jumped into the sea, and saved her. Tilly finally breathed a sigh of relief. The threat of the sinking ship was lifted, and at least she didn't have to worry about swimming to border town. Suddenly, she felt a chill on the tip of her nose and looked up, only to freeze on the spot. Snowflakes were floating in the sky. Tilly understood that snow represented the beginning of the month of the demons. It was only autumn and it was already snowing, which meant that border town must have started being attacked by demonic beasts. A few days later, they arrived at the place where they had picked up the witches from slumbering all last time. Tilly was very interested in the hot air balloon. Before disembarking, she asked Captain Jack to wait here for a few days. Tilly began to ascend and then asked Savvy to summon an invisible barrier to let everyone slowly rise. Before long, they crossed over the mountaintop. Then, under Ash's guidance, it took them half a day to finally arrive at border town. The first thing that caught Tilly's eye was a uniquely shaped steel bridge. Ashes thought it was a waste of materials, as a pontoon bridge would solve the transportation issue. Andrea elegantly wagged her finger and said that it had its value. Once the town expanded, a pontoon bridge would obstruct river transportation. Tilly didn't care about their routine dispute but set her eyes on the other side of the river. After crossing the steel bridge, immediately two guards came over and asked what they were doing. One of the guards looked at them carefully and asked if they were witches. This question caught Tilly off guard. Although she already knew that the existence of witches was public in this town, when she personally heard an ordinary person ask the sentence in such a calm tone, it still stirred a wave in her heart. She nodded, and the guard smiled and asked them to wait there. Then he immediately ran towards border town. Just as Ashes was about to speak about Tilly's identity, she was interrupted by Tilly. Tilly was curious about how Roland would receive a witch from another city. Not long after, a tall blonde woman dressed in a white robe walked over. It was Nightingale, and Ashes greeted briefly, and Tilly could feel the sharp aura emanating from Nightingale. Without a doubt, this woman was a combat witch, and an incredibly powerful one. Nightingale looked at Ashes first and then swept her gaze over everyone. When her eyes landed on Tilly, she suddenly paused. The sharp feeling disappeared in an instant, replaced by warmth like water. She gently introduced herself first, recognizing Tilly as Roland's sister at first glance. Under Nightingale's guidance, they entered the castle. Sylvie was the first one to come over. She told them that the prince had already sent someone to notify the others. A voice that sounded familiar, yet strangely foreign, echoed from behind Sylvie. Tilly raised her head. A young man was smiling at her. His appearance had not changed much from her memories, but his smile and demeanor were completely different from before. "Welcome to border town, my dear sister," he said. Tilly's thoughts surged in her heart. She had many questions bubbling at the edge of her lips, yet her face remained calm. Following Roland Wimbledon into a room, she watched as he poured her a warm cup of red tea. Roland knew Tilly had a lot to discuss with him, So did he, but there was no rush. He glanced out the window at the snowy landscape, remarking, "Winter is still long this year." Grasping the cup, she didn't respond but seated herself by the wooden table, quietly studying Roland. His opening words were unlike anything her brother would say in her memories. This Roland Wimbledon was entirely different. He was attempting to control the conversation. Despite his gentle tone, it was the posture of someone in authority. Roland tilted his head, calling out the name Nightingale, who was worried for Roland's safety. Nightingale finally revealed herself, then left the room reluctantly after Roland reassured her with a smile that this was his sister, and there was no cause for concern. Roland poured Tilly another cup of tea, informing her that only the two of them remained in the room now. Tilly fell silent for a moment before finally asking the question that had been in her mind. Who is the person sitting in front of her right now? She was surprised by the swiftness of his response. Roland said he was her brother, Roland Wimbledon, the fourth prince of Grey Castle. Roland then admitted that he had changed significantly, but he was willing to explain everything slowly to Tilly. Everything started when he saved a witch. The story was not complicated, but it was deeply gripping. After recounting all that had transpired since he was assigned to the border town, in essence, a witch named Anna had deeply moved Roland. Through the saved witch, he had seen the evil of the church and its deception of the people. The subsequent assassination attempt by Garcia further revealed to him the darkness beneath the royal power, and even hiding in the corner couldn't spare him from the shadow of malevolence. He had finally decided to change everything. Tilly took the last sip of the tea. She took a deep breath. These explanations were somewhat satisfactory, but the most crucial point was how Roland had come across all this bizarre and exotic knowledge. Steam engines, firearms, none of which were taught in Grey Castle. Roland explained that all of this was because he suddenly acquired additional memories. He poured another cup of tea for Tilly. As she stared at the tea in her hands, she wondered, could it be the power of a witch? She quickly dismissed this thought and asked another question: how could Roland prove that he was indeed Roland and not just the additional memories? The question was a bit unreasonable, but Roland's tone remained calm. Roland's past was vivid in his mind. Although he had acquired many strange memories, he couldn't remember where they came from. Roland was still deeply marked by the image of him leaving Tilly crying on the shattered glass, so that was his proof. Roland paused, looking at Tilly. He had never apologized to her back then, and he hoped it wasn't too late to do so now. Tilly remained silent. The Roland before her was neatly dressed, his demeanor sincere, as if he were recounting an indisputable fact. The current Roland was certainly much better than the wastrel prince from her memories, but Tilly still had many questions. Seeing Tilly's confusion, Roland took a sip of his tea, stating his own surprise that his sister had also become a witch and had managed to hide it from everyone in the palace. He looked at Tilly, telling her that winter was still long, and he hoped that they could gradually understand each other. This was probably the best solution for now. Tilly nodded her agreement. Roland smiled, saying, "Tilly will come to love this place." After Tilly left the office, Roland let out a sigh. Outside, heavy snow was falling, and his heart was similarly in a tumult. It was clearly stressful to keep a straight face while spinning yarns in front of a smart person, especially while maintaining an expression of sincerity throughout. Nightingale flipped onto the table, looking at Roland, asking how he felt facing his witch sister. Roland shook his head. He had felt nothing but the pressure. Nightingale had thought it would be a deeply emotional reunion, but Roland knew that his relationship with Tilly hadn't been good when they were children, and he had often bullied her. Nightingale moved closer to Roland, implying, "Roland who never spent time alone with other unfamiliar witches." Roland blushed, but thought to himself, it's because he don't want Nightingale to see him lying. He didn't respond, leaning back in his chair, telling Nightingale, "She will understand someday." Nightingale reached out and touched his lips, hoping that Roland would tell her everything in the future. By evening, a grand feast was held in the castle hall. The food was even more plentiful than usual. The newly arrived witches from slumbering Isle salivated at the sight of the food-laden table. Those who were initially disdainful of the food in Border Town are now flushed with embarrassment. Amidst the clinking of goblets and flickering candlelight, the feast finally ended in a harmonious and lively atmosphere. After dinner, the fireplace blazed, and Roland sat with members of the witch union along one side of the long table. Tilly and the slumbering Isle witches sat on the opposite side. Macy, due to the sensitivity of her identity, simply transformed into a pigeon and perched on the chandelier above. Tilly was the first to speak. In addition to wanting to help Border Town repel the demonic beasts, she also planned to take back the 5 witches she had previously sent. She briefly described the current situation on Slumbering Isle, problems with food and housing that they needed Lien and Honey to solve. Roland felt a headache. The First Army could handle repelling the demonic beasts, and there was almost no need for the witches to fight, except for dealing with fast and flexible mixed breeds. But when it came to construction, the role of the witches was irreplaceable. The port was not yet accessible through the mountains, the dock was only half built, and he still wanted to construct more cave dwellings. When he asked if it could be delayed a little longer, Tilly reluctantly shook her head. She had found demonic sea beasts in the water and feared that these creatures would become increasingly ferocious. Leaving earlier would be safer. With no other options, Roland made a final effort. Apart from Lien and Honey, the other 3 hadn't completed their primary education, and he didn't want them to drop out halfway. Tilly couldn't help but smile, knowing that Roland valued them highly. Seeing through Roland's thoughts, she asked how he intended to utilize their abilities. Roland gave a brief explanation about solidifying metal parts and brewing. Tilly recalled how Candle and Evelyn had initially been worried about their abilities being useless on Slumbering Isle, and they were often. Tilly didn't finish her sentence, but Roland guessed it had to do with facing discrimination, much like Rem's experience back in the Witch Association. Tilly was pleased that Roland was so keen on keeping them. She looked to Evelyn and the others, curious to hear their thoughts. Sylvie was the first to respond, saying she would follow Tilly. Candle said quietly that she could be anywhere. Evelyn was silent for a moment before replying that if Tilly needed her, she would return to Slumbering Isle. Otherwise, she wished to stay in Border Town. She paused, adding that she still had much to learn from Scroll. Tilly noticed her nervousness and reassured them they could freely move between the 2 places at any time. Tilly then turned to her brother, expressing her desire to invite the witches from Border Town to visit Slumbering Isle. She hoped that through their efforts, witches would be able to live freely in the future. Roland nodded, recalling the last time Tilly had called him brother, which was more than a decade ago. He smiled and said, "That day will come soon." After they finished discussing this matter, Roland cleared his throat and spoke in a serious tone. "Now, let's discuss the demons and the ruins." He informed Tilly of the recent discoveries in the snowy mountains behind Border Town and in the hidden forest. The early arrival of heavy snow had disrupted his plans to explore the ruins and rescue the witch. Tilly was astonished to hear that the demon army was so close and that the ruins from more than 400 years ago were still inhabited. Roland planned to establish watchpoints along the coast to monitor the demons' movements. Tilly closed her eyes to think, recalling Roland's hot air balloon. She suggested that they should rescue the witch out of the ruins in the next few days. Roland replied that the balloon could only carry 10 people, and the larger one could only carry up to 15. Either way, it was impossible to include the soldiers of the First Army. If they encountered demons, the witches might get hurt, and coupled with the demonic beasts in the mountains, he thought it was too dangerous. Tilly mentioned that they now had Savvy, whose invisible barrier could protect against spears, while Ash could greatly enhance their combat power. Roland hesitated. The last time he fought against demons, they suffered due to aerial disadvantage. But then, he thought of Sylvie's ability to scout, Nightingale and Ash's powerful offensive capabilities, and the double shields of Anna and Savvy to ensure the team's safety. He looked at Tilly again, asking her if she was sure about this. Tilly honestly replied, "The early arrival of the month of the demons, and the emergence of demonic beasts in the sea, have given her a bad feeling. Therefore, she must go and look for all opportunity to solve the mystery." The gray sky was filled with swirling snowflakes. Maine and Tayfun slowly climbed onto the walls of Hermes City, which had just experienced a major battle. They had never seen snow so early. Maine looked down at the demonic beasts below the city wall. According to the Holy Book, they had only about 10 years left. They would use 2 years to unify the 4 kingdoms, then accumulate the army of God punishment soldiers. With the solid walls and terrain of Hermes, they would have the ability to fight the enemy. Tayfun closed his eyes and said he was old and couldn't see that time coming. The old man shook his head and laughed, deciding not to dwell on morbid thoughts anymore. He asked about the snow powder formula that Zero had obtained. Maine scornfully replied that although it could clear the demonic beasts, it had little effect on the real demons and hybrids. The only way to defeat the demons was a direct confrontation. Just then, a long horn sounded from the lookout tower on the side of the city wall. One long blast, then 2, and before the echo of the horn had ended, the 3rd horn blasted. Maine could hardly believe his ears. 3 horn blasts represented a situation of extreme urgency. The new holy city was in immediate danger. What on earth had the lookout seen? Maine quickly found the answer. Among the black tide of demonic beasts, there were 2 monsters of immense size. They had 4 robust tusks, 4 feet, and 2 hands, and were covered in pitch-black fur. Maine was completely overtaken by a terrifying thought. Why would the horror beast, which according to the Holy Book would only appear 5 years before the disaster, appear now in Hermes? The next day, Roland bid farewell to Lien and Honey in the castle's back garden. The 2 thanked Roland for his care over the past few months. Roland also gave the 2 witches gifts. Lien was slightly stunned, thinking it was another set of lingerie, but Honey was very happy and couldn't wait to unwrap it. She pulled out a long white strip of cloth. She was somewhat disappointed, wondering why it wasn't a bra. Roland coughed twice and said it was a scarf. He stepped forward, held up the cloth strip made of pure cotton, and wrapped it around her neck. This would keep her warm. There was another gift inside, a small mirror set in a wooden box. Honey's exclamation attracted the attention of the other witches. Soon, the witches from Slumbering Isle gathered around and took turns looking at themselves in the mirror. Tilly walked to Roland's side. She commented on the convenient water supply and comfortable rooms, and how much the place had changed in just a year. Roland smiled and asked if she regretted letting the witches come to Border Town. Tilly naturally didn't think so. She hoped that all witches could live better lives. Tilly prepared to join the rescue operation. Roland was worried about Tilly's safety, but Tilly said she could protect herself. To prove her point, she slowly lifted off the ground, her body floating in midair as if weightless. She then pointed her right hand at an open space, and a bright flash of lightning burst from her fingertips. Roland thought Tilly had 2 abilities. But Tilly said this was her little secret. She hadn't planned to reveal it to him. However, after the meeting last night, she misunderstood Roland. She was pleased that Roland could honestly tell her about the ancient ruins and share his knowledge, and also felt a bit apologetic. Roland said he understood, then Tilly asked about the clothing that Honey mentioned earlier. Roland almost choked on his own saliva and coughed twice before suggesting that she could ask Sylvie or Evelyn. Tilly seemed a bit dissatisfied, thinking that Roland was indeed withholding information from her. He sent Lien and Honey off with hot air balloon, and they started talking about the ruins again. Tilly wondered why these ruins belonged to the church but were abandoned. Many things were mysteries, such as the history of 400 years ago, the origin of God, and the magic stones and demons. After some thought, Tilly asked Roland, "Don't you feel like the church just appeared out of nowhere?" As Roland returned to his office, this question lingered in his mind. He closed his eyes, thinking about the religions of the modern world, each of which had its own history and a complete narrative describing the power of God and the origin. Compared to these, the church in this world seemed rather immature. Suddenly, Kyle walked into the office, bringing with him Charles. They had made significant progress in the large-scale production of nitric acid. Roland was surprised and pleased. He stood up excitedly and asked for details. Kyle chuckled and said that it was all Charles's credit. The young Charles seemed a little restrained. He bowed and then explained that they had dried saltpeter to obtain dilute nitric acid and then used concentrated sulfuric acid to purify it. Charles tried to put the two together, directly heating saltpeter in concentrated sulfuric acid. As a result, they successfully obtained a nitric acid solution with very high purity, even to the point of observing a smoking phenomenon. Roland immediately thought of exothermic reactions, but this was not the same. Charles himself didn't know why it worked. He conducted many experiments afterward and believed that his discovery was coincidental. Kyle interjected, explaining that he had made some deductions according to the chemical formula, guessing that some component in saltpeter had reacted with sulfuric acid to produce nitric acid, which then evaporated when heated. Suddenly, Roland remembered that his chemistry textbook indeed mentioned that before the invention of artificial ammonia production, people used sodium nitrate or potassium nitrate to react with concentrated sulfuric acid to produce nitric acid, which was the oldest industrial method. Of course, because this method consumes a large amount of sulfuric acid and is extremely corrosive to equipment, it was soon replaced by more advanced technology. But this won't be a problem in the border town. As for the strong corrosiveness of nitric acid vapor, it could be solved by psoriasis coating. Roland happily patted Charles on the shoulder. He had another task for him. He said with solemnity, now that they had a reliable source of nitric acid, the next step was to try to make a very dangerous item, nitroglycerin. Well, how dangerous you may ask? Rapid temperature changes, shocks, impacts, and friction could all potentially cause an explosion. However, both of alchemists didn't see this as dangerous, but rather as an interesting experiment. Roland needed this kind of powerful high explosive. And all three of them were excited to blow something up. Tilly's biggest interest was to stroll along the flat streets of Border Town and observe this remote domain that has undergone remarkable changes under the rule of Roland. The most impressive thing for her was probably the unparalleled vitality that this small town exudes. Andrea looked at the pedestrians coming and going on the street. Many people came out to work even in cold weather. Ashes naturally started arguing with her. Sylvie sighed and explained that the reason is simple. In winter, common folks are reluctant to move around because it consumes a lot of energy, they can't get enough to eat, and they are susceptible to catching a cold or disease, but these problems do not exist in the border town. Sylvie then went on to explain the operating model of Border Town, which leads to low food prices, and everyone can have enough to eat. When Ashes heard that Roland only bought and sold grain at fixed purchase and selling prices, she regarded this as forced buying and selling. Tilly then pointed out that wheat needs to be threshed, milled, and stored, which all require costs. Sylvie continued, saying that the extra fees collected can be used as wages for those workers handling the wheat, to build new granaries, and to expand the production scale, providing new job opportunities. Suddenly, a long bell rang from the direction of the city wall, which was an alarm for the demonic beast attack. They were already impatient to show Roland the combat ability of the witches from Slumbering Isle. When the bell rang, the entire camp boiled over. All the soldiers ran quickly to the wall along with the crowd. Everyone was not nervous, and their morale was high. One of the soldiers heard a rumor that a selective few would be incorporated into an elite artillery unit. Everyone was shocked and only Vanner was silent. Axe had found him a week ago and told him that Prince Roland planned to develop a new type of cannon, completely different from the field guns currently in use, and it wouldn't be given to the First Army, but would be placed on the ship, making it a warship with long-range attack capabilities. The operator of the new type of cannon will be the best member of the artillery team, and if Vanner wants to join, he can apply. Vanner, of course, agreed without hesitation. He was also told that if he could make great achievements, the newly built warships would be named after those who had made outstanding contributions. Vanner interrupts the discussion of the artillery team members, telling them to stay focused. Soon a large number of demonic beasts began to attack the city wall. The bullets of the revolving rifle were dense and continuous, and white smoke rose from the city wall. As soon as Andrea climbed up to a corner of the city wall, she saw a line of soldiers dressed as militiamen standing on the wall. They were holding a strange weapon in their hands, which was probably the firearms mentioned by Ashes. Although the firing rate was fast, the accuracy was very low. Ashes said that these people used to be miners, farmers, and hunters, and they had only used this weapon for 6 months. Tilly thought for a moment and asked Sylvie about the firearms. Sylvie said that firearms were similar to crossbows. But they fired a small ball using the impact of the explosion of black powder. Suddenly, a creature that looked like a giant turtle, with a huge shell on its back, rushed over. Andrea was immediately energized. She asked Ashes to cover her, and Ashes reluctantly drew the big sword from her back, ready for battle. Sylvie stopped her, but Andrea didn't hear the latter half of Sylvie's words. She only heard a deafening explosion, like thunder exploding next to her ears. Turning her head, the metal tubular objects on the city wall spewed out flames simultaneously. The big long and hard tubes fired ammunition far beyond her arrows. The battle didn't last long and ended very quickly. A swath of demonic beast corpses lay in front of the city wall, and the flowing hot blood caused a white smoke to float above the snow. Back at the castle, His Highness Roland still prepared a hearty dinner for the witches. It seemed that no matter how the world changed, the warm and welcoming nature of this small town remained unchanged, leaving a deep impression on all who visited or lived there. Looking at the variety of dishes on the table, Andrea felt even more upset. Whether it's weapons or food, everything was too powerful. She had always thought that food sprinkled with various spices and sauces was an extremely vulgar way of eating, and that seasonings were only used to cover up the flaws in the food itself. But every dish on the table was terrifyingly delicious. Whether it was mushrooms or what looked like ordinary vegetable soup, and most special of all, the ice cream sandwich dessert. The milk-scented ice cream sandwiched between 2 slices of bread. After taking a bite, the cold and soft feeling was simply too addictive. She kept telling herself that this was the last piece, the last piece. Looking at Ashes, who showed a provocative smile at her, Andrea didn't respond for the first time. On the 3rd day, with the completion of the assembly of the large hot air balloon, the day to start exploring the ruins had arrived. This time, the hot air balloon flew very low, almost scraping over the rooftops of the town. Most of the townsfolk witnessed the hot air balloon, with many stunned in place, and others cheering for His Highness Roland. Perhaps in their eyes, only the Lord of Border Town could create such miracles. As they passed the western city wall, the soldiers of the First Army all saluted in unison, greeting Lightning and Macy in the air. Tilly looked at Lightning. It seemed that she really liked it here. Savvy sighed, saying this was the first time she had seen the Western Territory covered in heavy snow. Savvy had also lived in the Western Territory before, then sneaked on the Slumbering Isle by boat after hearing about rumors that the Slumbering Isle was harboring witches. Wendy now understood why, when the rumors of Border Town harboring witches had spread, no witches had ever visited them. Savvy was surprised to learn that Roland had also put out messages to gather witches. Ashes came over and said smugly, indeed they were spreading messages, and that Tassa was once caught right by her. Andrea scoffed and said if Ashes hadn't met Lady Tilly, she might have gone to Border Town long ago. Ashes replied, saying she wouldn't do anything for His Highness Roland. Andrea repeated it, replicating Ashes' voice, saying Ashes was quite proficient in saying it, calling him His Highness already, and the two started arguing again. Tilly couldn't help but smile, telling them that whether it was Slumbering Isle or Border Town, they should stop dividing themselves. She turned around, her gaze sweeping over the many witches. Nightingale and Anna also smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. Tilly's gaze landed on Anna. If she had to choose one of them who left the deepest impression, it would probably be this woman who had a profound influence on Roland. Suddenly, Lightning looked down. When they arrived at their destination, everyone was stunned by the sight. The stone tower had disappeared, and a huge hole had appeared on the ground. Sylvie used her ability to look inside. She looked very uncomfortable. A monster resembling a maggot was moving toward the northwest, and the ruins were in its belly. What should they do next? Everyone turned their eyes to Tilly unanimously. Tilly asked if there were other things, like demons. Sylvie observed for a while and then shook her head, saying there were only some demonic beasts, but they were all in its belly and seemed to have died. Tilly thought for a moment and decisively said they would land now. Some people will stay outside, and others will follow her into the hole to kill the giant beast and retrieve the sealed witch.